Hi, and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Illustrator by Eduonix Technologies. This is the second video, and we're going to be going over the Illustrator Preferences dialog box. I'm using Windows 7 in Illustrator CS6. So if I want to edit my preferences, I'll go up here to the menu under Edit and go down to Preferences. If you're using a Mac, it's under the Illustrator menu option, which is right to the left of File. And just so everybody knows, when I say a shortcut key is Control something or Alt something, that would be Command or Option, respectively, if you're using a Mac. I went up to Edit Preferences, and a little pop-up menu comes out if you hold your mouse over it. And here I'm going to go to General. Now once you're already in there, you can select any of the preferences that you could in the menu itself. So let's just look at the first one, keyboard increment. The keyboard increment is the amount that if I were to press up on the keyboard, it would change whatever value in Illustrator by that amount. So it's currently set to 1 as the default value. You can set it to whatever you want, and you can also set the units to whatever you want. So if I were to go up here with the current settings of 1 and just click up on the keyboard, as you see it's going up by 1. So it's pretty simple and also pretty useful. Okay, and I also wanted to mention that I'm only really going to be going into the things that I find the most important, that I use the most. There's a lot of preferences, and it would take forever to explain them all, so I'm going to be going over the most basic ones. Now the next one is Constrain Angle. This is a very useful tool. As you'll find out later in the videos, we can achieve certain things by holding in Shift or Control or Alt. And one of these is when we're rotating an object. Currently it rotates by, I believe, 45 degrees or 30 degrees or something. It says 0 in this option, but it's just on default. If I were to set it to something like 90 degrees, then whenever I rotate something, it'll snap. There will only be 4 different kinds of rotation. Regular and upright, turned totally to the side, 90 degrees, turned upside down, turned again another 90 degrees, and then if you turn it one more time, it would be upright again. That would be if I set this to 90. If I set it to something like 45, which I think is the default, when you're holding in Shift and rotating something, it snaps automatically in 45-degree increments, and you'll find out this is really useful. Corner radius defines the radius of the rounded rectangle tool. Not very useful in my opinion, since you can add rounded corners to other shapes. So as you can see here, these are more or less the defaults. I'm pretty sure these are the exact defaults. I don't change much in these panels. One thing I'm going to change right now is double click to isolate. What this does is it makes it so shapes can be focused on, essentially. It's something that's new, I think, to CS3 or CS4. And I don't find it very useful. I find it actually gets in the way a lot. So basically, you isolate a shape, so when you click on things, you're not clicking on other shapes. It's kind of like locking everything else and just focusing on that shape. There's a lot of other ways you can do that, and I find it just gets in the way. Scale strokes and effects. This one is really useful. It's also accessible over in the panels on the right. So you usually want to have this clicked. If I were to make a square with a radius, a stroke of 1 point, and I wanted to make that square bigger, if I didn't have scale, strokes, and effects selected, it would still be 1 point. When I make the square bigger, the stroke will still be the same size. So if I had a really thick stroke and I made the shape really big, the stroke would be the same thickness, although the shape would be bigger. You generally want to keep this selected right here because it's a preview option basically, but it rounds out edges, smooths them out just for your viewing. It's not for the actual software or for the actual final product. Show tooltips. I still have it on. I don't think I'll ever turn it off because there's a lot of tooltips built into Illustrator. It's not just when you hover over a tool or a panel. It's for just about anything can bring up a tooltip. So it's really handy. And use precise cursors. This is also the caps lock key. Now, that's really a preference, and it really depends on what you're doing as whether or not you want that on, but it's caps lock, so you don't need to go in here every time you want to turn it on or off. Same with the scale, strokes, and effects. It's over in the panels. So a lot of these are easy to access, and generally the ones that are the most useful. So let's move along here. Selection and anchor display. Now I keep these the same aside from the snap to point. When you have Illustrator set to snap to certain things, there's a certain tolerance as far as how close your mouse has to be for it to snap. And if you know from other programs, this can be kind of irritating. So if you find that it's shooting over to the point and you're just trying to drag something close to the point and you can't because it keeps on attaching to the point, you'd set your snap to point, but you'd really just take it off for a second, or you could set it to a lower value. And the other thing is control click to select objects behind, and that one's really useful. So you might even want to get into your preferences to check to see if you have that selected, because that comes in handy a lot. Highlight anchors on mouse over, that one's selected by default. It's pretty handy because you can see the shape when you just hover over it with a mouse. You can see all the anchors, so it lets you know exactly what you're selecting. So I like to keep that on. It doesn't really ever get in the way. Show handles when multiple anchors are selected. If you select that, then when you have multiple anchors selected, it's going to show all the handles which control the curves. So type object selection by path only is the first one we're going to look at. All the other stuff I don't think I've ever really used. They're basic increments and they're changeable in other ways. There's really nothing to talk about in the type section because most of these things that are useful enough are changeable outside of the preferences dialog box, like size tracking, baseline shift. I'm just going to move on to units. These are also changeable outside, but as you can see, you can do them all right here too, and you can change whatever units Illustrator's using for the rulers and basically as a default, although you can type in whatever you want whenever you're entering in a value for size or for anything. You can type in IN for inches, CM for centimeters, which would override these settings. If you're using print, you can set this to something like inches, centimeters. If you're using web, you'd set it to pixels. Of course, like I said, you can override that with anything. Now on to guides and grids. This is the default color for your guides. It's set to a good color. They've thought this out. This color stands out. you might want to set it to a darker color if you're using a white background or something very light, or vice versa if you're using a dark background, although it tends to show up really well on each one. And you can set it to lines or dots, as you can see. With grid is basically just the same settings as guides, but you get to determine the default grid, which, as you can see, is set to 1 inch with 8 subdivisions. So you can change that, or you can change it as you're making the grid itself. It's not incredibly useful to change these things here. So let's just move on to Smart Guides. Smart Guides is a very useful tool. The first option you have is color and light guides and grid, and it's not anything that's going to print, so it's purely for your preferences, for whatever works best for you and for your documents in general. The next option is alignment guides. Right under it, alignment guides tell you when you're dragging something what it is aligned to, essentially, and it'll pop up with a little green word telling you. It's pretty easy to understand. Basically, this whole section defines the little notes, messages, and lines, guides, and things that pop up when you're manipulating objects, mostly when you're moving them. Object highlighting is pretty self-explanatory. Transform tools deal with when you're transforming objects. They give you little hints and pop-ups in the color you selected. Anchor and path labels are good to keep selected, as well as measurement labels. That's what I was talking about when I said the little words that pop up. Basically everything on here you should keep selected for the time being. You'll notice what they are as they pop up. Show slice numbers. Shows little numbers whenever you're slicing something, which is useful so you can know the order of the slices that it's going to be printed out. Slicing is used for creating websites or for just saving multiple files from one document. If you cut something up into slices, it saves each one of those as a file. It's mostly for web. At least that's what I use it for. My colleagues use it for the most. So just visual preferences here. In dictionary and hyphenation, this is pretty basic. I have mine set to English, United States. You just want to set it to your country. And basically all it does is determine where it's going to put hyphens based on the language you select. It's a pretty simple preference, but when you're dealing with format and design in Illustrator, it's useful to make sure that you do have it set to the country you're designing for, the language you're designing for. Plugins and scratch disks. It's very useful, unless you're running with 50 processors and 1,000 gigabytes of RAM. These scratch disks come in really handy. They extend the amount of virtual memory you have. If you're Windows or if you're on a Mac, you generally have a scratch disk. This is like a separate scratch disk. So keep these settings on default unless you want to change the drive. As for the user interfaces, with CS6 they made the default user interface kind of dark. So if you like the old one, make it light. It's not too big of a deal. Kind of threw me when I got the program, but I got used to it pretty quickly. Auto collapse iconic panels. As you see, the panels on the right, way over here, are all collapsed. That's what they look like, collapsed. When I click one like I did in the previous video, it pops out. And it stays out until I click on the canvas if I have auto collapse It basically just controls how things transfer between programs and what is copied when you copy something. Since Illustrator's vector, it has certain rules. Just leave everything on default on this one.
For the appearance of black, just leave that one the same, just like what we've been doing with most of these. But now you know where everything is when you want to change it later. So that concludes this lecture on preferences, and thank you for watching.